Well, 4 of the state's last 7 governors have done or are still doing a stint in prison. Countless state lawmakers, Chicago aldermen investigated by the authorities. We got a mayor who's known nationally for sending a dead fish to someone who did him wrong. Remember that? From Squeezy the Pension Python to this year's Quinocchio, Illinois has its fair share of ridiculous politics. So in a new weekly segment, we're bringing together 2 brilliant minds to help sort through the mess. They call themselves the Common Sense Caucus. So welcome to the show, Chicago Tribune editorial board member Kristen McQueary and Tribune columnist Eric Zorn. And such a pleasure. You've both been on the show separately. Now I get to talk to you together. Kristen, let me start with you. We're going to talk about the governor's race a little bit. And I seem to remember a video I saw on the Tribune site in which you said several months ago, you know, if the election were held now, Pat Quinn, you win. You still feel that way?
I actually do. I think if the election were held today, Pat Quinn would win in a very close race. You know, the economy in the state is getting better. We're still among the top 10 worst in unemployment rates, but it's getting better. You can never underestimate the power and organization of public sector unions in this state. The Republicans have never been able to get a field organization together on election day. And I do think he's getting some mileage out of Rauner refusing to release his income tax returns.
So, Eric, of course, Rauner says he will release returns or some version of them by October 15th. What do you think? If you were calling the race today, do you agree with Kristen that it could be a Quinn's to win?
I don't. I think that you look at back to 4 years ago, the Republicans put up a really pretty lousy candidate in Bill Brady, and he almost beat Pat Quinn. I think it was like 3 votes per precinct. Rauner is much better funded, he's much better organized, and Pat Quinn this time has got this issue hanging over his head about his integrity. You have the problem that we have with the Department of Transportation hires that's been coming out this week, that there's the sense that patronage was continuing under him and jobs that shouldn't have been. There's also the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative, that anti-crime problem, where the program that looked like they threw away $54 million in taxpayer money. So Pat Quinn's brand has been damaged, and Kristen's right, the economy is slowly coming back, but I think my sense in talking to people is that they're in the mood for a change, and if they're not too scared of Bruce Rauner, they'll vote for him. So I would have, right now, I would say that the field favors Rauner.
And, you know, Kristen, it is true. Look, if you look at the ads, and they're both attacking each other, for Quinn, it is all, as Eric says, about NRI and the neighborhood initiative. Where did the money go? Rauner, the attacks against Rauner seem to be he's rich, he found loopholes in the system, so don't elect him governor.
Right, and I do think those are gaining traction with voters. I think voters can tolerate and support a successful businessman, you know, running for governor, but someone who appears to be trying to not pay his fair share. I'm not saying that Bruce Rauner did do that, but I think Pat Quinn is doing a good job of characterizing him as a tax dodger, and I think that's easier for voters to understand. They don't like that, and they're not following along as much on the 2 investigations into the Quinn administration.
And Eric, you have to admit, Quinn is, you know, I don't care what the polls say about how he's a likable guy. People tend to think he's a decent, good guy. Although, can he proceed without the support of his friends Madigan and Cullerton, who I just note did not show up at Governor's Day at the State Fair?
Yeah, but they're supporting him in the end because they know that he needs to be in office for them to get done what little they can get done. Yes, Pat Quinn is a very likable guy. I think, you know, all of us on this panel know him and respect him and think that his heart is generally in the right place. But like I say, voters have this sense of him as this guy who is all about good government, but I think that has been damaged right now. Now, if he can repair it before the election, yeah, maybe. But the other thing is that Rauner's campaign is very disciplined. He is not going out on very many limbs. He's not particularly gaffe prone in the last 6 or 7 months. So I think Quinn's got a real fight on his hands. The other thing is that Rauner's got just about limitless money to spend. And as we turn the corner now after Labor Day, when you know the common wisdom is that people really start paying attention to this race, it's going to be a question of who is going to be able to define the other candidate. And it's going to be, you know, I think a lot of people are going to vote for the person they don't want to be governor rather than the person they do.
It's a lesser of 2 evils sometimes. Kristen, speaking of money, Rahm Emanuel's got a lot of it, $8 million plus in his account to take on any challengers. What's your sense with Tony Preckwinkle out of the race? Is there anybody who's a viable challenger to Rahm? And of course, Karen Lewis would be the one you'd have to mention, or maybe Bob Fioretti.
Sure. I mean, I think Karen Lewis is a big threat to Rahm Emanuel. The Tribune poll that we did recently showed him sinking drastically in African American wards, and those are wards that he won in 2011. He was Obama's chief of staff, that gave him a lot of street cred in those communities, and his numbers are dropping quickly. So I think Karen Lewis at least gives him a run for the money in terms of a runoff election. As you know, whoever in February wins needs 50% at least of the vote to avoid an April runoff. And I think if she gets in, we're going to get a runoff.
Eric, what's your thought? I mean, I think if Tony Prenkwinkle had been in the race, that race is much tougher than this one. What is your thought? Karen Lewis have a shot?
I think does have a shot for the reasons that Kristen said. And if you notice, this week, Rahm Emanuel came out for a $13 minimum wage in Chicago. He said we're going to have that $13 minimum wage no matter what the voters say this fall. There's an advisory referendum on the ballot. No matter what the state does, we're going to $13. That is a bold, progressive move, and I think trying to take back some of the territory that he feels that he has lost to, the Karen Lewis faction, but maybe the Bob Fioretti faction. You put them all under the umbrella of the not Rahm faction. And you know what, Kristen's point is very good, that you do need 50% plus one vote to win outright the mayoral election. Otherwise, you go to a runoff. If Bob Fioretti gets in, if he manages to get 10% of the vote, I think Karen Lewis has 30% of the vote probably in the bag. That she has that kind of reach. The question is, can she go above that much higher? And I'm not sure that she can right now. There's a lot of people who feel like she's too in bed with the unions, that she's not the person to solve education problems in Chicago. And we have not heard much now from Emanuel about the case that he's going to make for himself. And he does have a case to make for himself. So right now we're in a bit of a slow period for this mayoral race. But I do think that Karen Lewis is serious, and I think that it's going to be an interesting race, and I'm glad that we're going to have a race.
Kristen, do you think Karen Lewis can handle issues other than education? She was on the show last week, and I reminded her of a Mayor Bolandic who lost his job over a snowstorm, Jane Byrne who fought a firefighter strike. I mean, she's not the politician in the true sense of the word, not the way Rahm is.
That's true. She has been doing better, though. If you've been listening to her being interviewed, people are asking her pretty tough questions about the city's finances, and she does have solutions. I mean, I don't know that we want a commuter tax necessarily. I don't know how viable her solutions are, but she is realistically looking at TIF district money and different ways to try to make our pension payments. So she's got time to study up, and I think that's what she's doing.
So, Erica, I read your column. I always read your column, both of you, and you wrote about term limits earlier in the week, suggesting that the fact that the court didn't stand by it, you said not such a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing. First of all, the Illinois Constitution just forbids a referendum, a citizen initiative referendum on something like term limits. And the courts pointed that out. And we learned this 20 years ago when Pat Quinn was behind the 8 is Enough campaign and the Supreme Court nixed that. I'm very skeptical of term limits for a couple of reasons. One, I think that we do have the term limit at the ballot box for most legislators. And it's also, when you have all these term limits, experience in other states shows that the lobbyists and the bureaucrats end up with a lot of power. So I'm skeptical of it for that reason. I would have welcomed the debate. I'd like to see it, but I do think that it's not a bad thing. What I do want to see, though, is some movement to initiate term limits for legislative leaders. The problem, it's basically it's an anti-Mike Madigan movement.
And I think you're right, Kristen. Let me come to you on that because I know I think you feel a little bit differently about the term limit concept. John Cullerton's been on the show. He said we have term limits. They're called elections, but in this state where they draw the maps, we really don't, do we?
We don't. I support term limits. I used to feel the way Eric does, but we don't have fair elections here. The Tribune did an investigative series last year showing that just in the suburbs alone, 200 candidates had objections filed to their petitions over things like paper clips and signature, challenges that were not valid. 76 of those candidates got kicked off the ballot. This is a system that is set up for the incumbents. It's set up for the legislative leaders. We don't have fair elections at the ballot box, and therefore I support term limits. And I think that people like Eric should have had a chance to vote no. The Supreme Court wouldn't even take up the case, and I think that's very disheartening for voters.
Well, we don't have a citizen initiative like they do in California here in Illinois. For better or worse, this was the Constitution of 1970 set that up. I think that Pat Quinn should have, I wish that he had gotten into the bully pulpit and tried to get the legislature to initiate an amendment on legislative term limits, leadership term limits. But obviously that would have failed, and it would have made him look a little weak, so he didn't do it. But the Pat Quinn that we knew 20 years ago, who was behind all these things, is not the Pat Quinn we have in the governor's office right now.
Yeah, well, I think that term limits on the leadership may be where this thing needs to focus. It's never going to happen, not under the current speaker. Well, my thanks to the Common Sense Caucus. We look forward to seeing you every week. Chicago Tribune editorial board member Kristen McQueary and Tribune columnist Zorn. Great fun. See you soon, and we'll have more politics tonight when we come back.